Um, Thank you very much to ODI for the invitation to speak today. I'm very pleased to be here. I've never spoke in such august surroundings before, so it's quite a new experience for me. As Alison said, I currently work for One. I am the lead on policy for One on governance, transparency and accountability. As many of you might imagine, One provides quite an interesting location to think about kind of the complexities of the results agenda and issues of multiple, dual, sometimes competing accountabilities. What I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to begin with saying a bit about what impossible geometries are, why do impossible geometries matter, how do impossible geometries come about, and how might impossible geometries be addressed. I should say that I'm using, in this brief talk, I'm using accountability as the entry point rather than results, while recognising clearly that, as Claire Malamed from ODI has said, without measurement, there can be no accountability. So firstly, what are impossible geometries? Well, firstly, I must credit Paolo D'Orenzio, a former colleague of mine at ODI, for the phrase impossible geometries. So impossible geometries refers to a situation that arises when organisations, or even an individual, when organisations are pulled in different directions by their various stakeholders. Either because their stakeholders want different things, or because their stakeholders have different ideas about the best way to get to the thing that they want. So it's either differences about the vision that they want to achieve, or differences about the route to achieving that vision. So for an aid agency, while prioritising accountability to taxpayers, the top half of the diagram above the dotted black line, while prioritising accountability to taxpayers might lead, depending on which set of accountabilities an aid agency prioritises, it will do different things. So above the line is when an aid agency is making itself primarily accountable to taxpayers, and at the bottom is when an aid agency is making itself primarily accountable to recipients. Some of these differences and contrasts are drawn very clearly in the World Development Report, with more examples and more concrete examples. But basically, if an aid agency is making itself accountable to taxpayers, it is more likely to proceed with caution. If it's making itself more accountable to recipients, and it may be more open to taking risks. Similarly, the red line, planting the flag, or planting the flag where an aid agency wants to get involved in all sectors in a particular country to show that it's doing something, whereas on the other hand, it might be a better idea to kind of engage in a division of labour and focus on some areas. And I guess most obviously, if an aid agency is making itself primarily accountable to its taxpayers, it might focus on quick wins, vaccines for instance, rather than long-term institution building. So why do impossible geometries matter? Well, basically, in situations where everyone, or all stakeholders, need to be kept on board, impossible geometries make it difficult for organisations to move forward effectively, no matter what the measure of effectiveness. More concretely, why do impossible geometries matter? Well, here I kind of draw on an excellent short article by Till Bruckner, which appeared on the DevX website earlier this year, drawing on his experiences in Afghanistan. So Till Bruckner says, imagine a situation in Afghanistan where a donor country office has $10 million to spend. Different stakeholders want that money to be spent in different ways. In the donor's own country, the Ministry for Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Defence want it to be spent on roads to help farmers to bring their produce to market, and also to enable troops to be transported to particular areas of the country effectively. The National Farmers Association back home lobbies for the money to be spent on tied food aid. That can alleviate hunger and help to ensure that Western farmers can sell their produce. The Afghan government wants the money to be provided as budget support. Parliamentarians back home want the money to be under strict control so that taxpayers and parliamentarians in the donor country can see what's done with it. Afghan farmers with sizable land holdings want to see their irrigation projects funded. And then on the other hand, landless Afghans are clamouring for free food. So different approaches or different accountabilities favour different stakeholders. And Till Bruckner puts this very starkly, but I think it's accurate, and in a way it kind of reflects some of what Sue was saying. Because the world of donor speak is a happy world in which donors, NGOs, host governments, parliamentarians, and a myriad of interest groups are all united in the single-minded pursuit of global poverty reduction. The real world is different, Accountability is power. More accountability does not always lead to win-win outcomes. It's put quite starkly, but I think there's a lot of truth in it. So then very briefly, I mean, this is kind of the issue about debates about aid and aid effectiveness. Why do impossible geometries matter? Because if you get the incentives aligned and the accountabilities working together well and reconciled or bridged, to use Sarah's term, then you can have aid that is effective, aid that helps to reduce poverty, then continued public support for levels of aid and for perhaps increased levels of aid, and then continuing aid effectiveness. So if the accountabilities work well together, then you can have a virtuous circle of effective aid, reduced poverty, and continued public support for aid. If, on the other hand, the accountabilities are not working well together, are not reconciled, then aid will be ineffective because it's not responding to local priorities. There's no accountability to people in the developing countries, increased poverty, and then declining public support for aid. There are, within these two slides, some rather big assumptions about the relationship between aid and poverty reduction, but I'll move on from those for the moment. So, how do impossible geometries come about? Well, I mean, the fact that there can be multiple and competing accountabilities really shouldn't be a surprise. If there are multiple stakeholders, there are multiple accountabilities. If there are diverse stakeholders with different values and views, then there are going to be competing accountabilities. It's all about interests, power and politics. It often seems to me that whenever anyone used the term accountability, they were forced to explain accountability from whom, to whom, for what, how and where, as the Institute for Development Studies advised us about 6 or 7 years ago, then many of these debates would be much clearer from the start. It wouldn't remove the real problem, but it would help to give some clarity to things. Or another way of kind of explaining how impossible geometries come about is I'll kind of borrow the words from Owen Barder in his blog earlier this year, which was reflections on 3 years of working on aid transparency, where in Owen's words, he was kind of saying, you know, transparency is not zero-sum, transparency is non-rival, and in effect, transparency is a public good. Accountability, on the other hand, accountability can be zero-sum, or it is at least subject to trade-offs. So while transparency is a public good, accountability is about politics and power. My slice of the pie comes at the expense of your slice of the pie. So it seems quite strange that much of the aid effectiveness debate has, as Sue mentions, neglected politics. Or to put it differently, the reason why the fact of multiple and competing accountabilities seems to have snuck up on the aid effectiveness agenda says a lot about how the aid effectiveness agenda and development debates more widely have proceeded. So debates about aid effectiveness, it seems to me, have proceeded as if aid and development are technical matters rather than being fundamentally political. And those debates have proceeded as if it's possible to come up with solutions that will work anywhere, regardless of the political context. This is what Matt Andrews at Harvard University talks about as hippos in the Sahara, which I think is a great phrase, referring to donors' preference for promoting particular sorts of best practice, sometimes with insufficient attention to local contexts. So hippos in the Sahara, or as Lant Pritchett from the Centre for Global Development would put it, prioritising form over function, or institutional isomorphism. I think I prefer hippos in the Sahara. So, to move on to results a bit, I mean, while I think that a focus on results is a good thing, as a side track, there was a great debate on Duncan Green of Oxfam's blog earlier this year, I think in March, about the results agenda, with guest blogs from Ros Eben and from Claire Malamed of ODI. And it was a great debate, and at the end, Duncan Green put up a poll to say, you know, did people think the results agenda was a good thing or not? And I toppled off the fence. I sat on the fence for quite a long time. I may have jumped back on it now. I sat on the fence for quite a long time, but I toppled off and said that, yes, I thought it was the results agenda was basically a good thing. That blog debate is a great one, great to look at. So, while I think that a focus on results is a good thing, whether that's about value for money, making sure that there's 100 pence of value for every pound of aid, or whether that's about exploring the potential and the limits of cash on delivery aid, or whether that's about working out how to close the broken feedback loop, questions will always remain about whose results matter most. And also, questions will remain about what impact a focus on results will have on the politics. That, again, that's kind of one of Paolo D'Orenzio's objections to cash-on-delivery aid, where he makes the point that if you're expecting cash-on-delivery aid and that sort of results focus to change the politics and the accountability relationships in a developing country, then that ain't going to happen. Put differently, transparency and information provide an essential basis for accountability. Information is the currency of accountability, and information is a form of power. And changes to the informational landscape might change the political landscape too, but other forms of power can win. So changes to the informational landscape, perhaps making the most of kind of new technologies, new and old technologies, can help to change the informational landscape, might change the political landscape, but information is not the only form of power. So transparency is necessary but not sufficient. Just to conclude, so where does this leave us? I mean, in a way, all I've said is that it's all about power. And changes in the informational landscape, one element of power, might lead to changes in the wider landscape of power. But power resists. In the article that I mentioned by Till Bruckner, he has rather a sitting on the fence conclusion. He says, I have no easy solutions to propose, but we need to decide what the aid accountability agenda is actually trying to achieve. Transparency and accountability are not ends in themselves. They are means to an end. If we want to use accountability as a tool to make aid more effective at helping the poor, we have to abandon the comforts of donor speak and seriously engage with the complex world of conflicting interests, mixed political agendas, and most importantly of all, power. So it's all a bit chicken and egg. So, which there, is why we need to think of ways forward. And I thought that Sarah's emphasis on bridging accountabilities and John talking about reconciling different accountabilities and different expectations of results was extremely helpful. I just want to say finally a very little bit about how at one we are trying to kind of think through and bridge some of those accountabilities and move forward on this. So firstly, in relation to the South, in relation to developing countries, we think that it's about trying to make sure that aid doesn't undermine state-citizen accountability in developing countries. It's also about taking a realistic approach to governance, as Sue suggests, promoting transparency, both at a global and a local level, and building capacity for accountability so that local solutions can emerge. And then secondly, and just to say a little bit about what that is about, so three things that one is working on that I can say more about in questions is firstly the aid effectiveness agenda. Secondly, a big and emerging agenda on budget or fiscal transparency. There's a new global initiative on fiscal transparency, which is about kind of in effect trying to reconcile or bridge some of these different accountabilities in practice, and also one's continuing work on extractive transparency, which is at both a global and a local level. And finally, in the North, I think the way of bridging these accountabilities is about promoting honest and informed debate about aid, governance and development, something that I know that ODI is and will continue to be at the forefront of. Thank you.